Welcome to the Deep Dive Pulpit Chair.
Glad to be here.
Today we're diving headfirst into some really fundamental, challenging ideas. They come from an early but incredibly influential work by a thinker who really reshaped how we think about art, culture, even ourselves.
It's one of those texts, looks kind of simple maybe at first, but boy, it just opens up layer after layer the deeper you go.
Definitely.
We're working from excerpts and notes today on the birth of tragedy, and in it, the author is wrestling with the very origins of Greek tragedy. He argues it met this, violent end, and then, maybe surprisingly, finds hope for a cultural rebirth.
And our mission in this deep dive, it isn't just to, summarize the book.
Right.
It's more to use these sources as our map, really,
Yeah.
to understand the core forces he's identifying, these deep currents shaping human experience, and why he thought they mattered so much, not just back in ancient Greece, but, in his own time, and maybe, just maybe, still for us today.
Exactly. He's not just doing ancient history here. He's trying to diagnose the cultural health of his own moment and maybe even glimpse its future.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. To
Right.
really get inside this book, it probably helps to know a little about the mind that created it. Our source gives us some background on his family, his early life.
It does. It paints a picture of, a family with strong intellectual leanings, definitely, and a certain gravitas, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
On his father's side, we hear about his grandfather, Dr. Nietzsche, a distinguished clergyman, and his grandmother described as active-minded and exceptionally good-natured.
Sounds like a strong background.
Yeah, his father's family had this quality of self-control, apparently, and a really lively interest in ideas. Strong family unit.
And his father himself. The description makes him sound quite gifted.
Oh, yeah. Youngest son, talent for poetry, music, delicate sensibilities, considerate. Quite the picture.
And there's that detail about Polish descent. He mentioned it often.
He did, yeah. Seemed quite attached to it, even tried researching it, though some documents were lost later. A family tradition about a Polish nobleman, Nicky.
Interesting. And longevity ran in the family, too, it seems.
And on both sides, yes. Several ancestors lived well into their 80s, even 90.
Which just makes what happened to his father even more stark.
Absolutely. Dying at only 38 after that awful fall down stone steps. I mean, that kind of early loss, it casts a long shadow. Definitely shaped his world.
So his mother moves him to Naumburg. They live with his grandmother, and he gets this upbringing described with Spartan severity and simplicity. That phrase really jumps out.
It does, doesn't it?
Yep.
It was apparently characteristic of the time, but it sounds like his grandmothers helped temper it a bit. And it was one of them, Grandfather Oler, who first saw something extraordinary in his talents.
Right. Moving on to his schooling. He was a robust kid, healthy, often mistaken for a peasant boy.
Apparently so, except for these striking eyes and a very formal manner, even as a child. A bit reserved.
And then Fortis school. That seems key.
Oh, definitely key. Entered at 14. It was famous, but known for its severe discipline, really demanding standards. That experience, that rigorous mental and physical exertion, you can see how it influenced his later ideas about training and self-discipline.
He didn't jump straight to university, though. Started at 20.
Right, took his time.
Yeah.
But his talents were already showing. That musical gift as a boy was significant. He actually considered making music his life.
Wow. But academically?
Just as striking, his very first paper in philology as a student under the famous Ritschl was apparently so good it got published straight away, which was, basically unheard of for someone so young. Ritschl saw the spark immediately.
He sounds like quite the combination at this point. Intense study, but also physical energy.
Yeah, a great lover of outdoor exercise, swimming, skating, generally even-tempered, apparently, with a warm laugh, a kind of harmonious whole. The only real issue noted was short-sightedness, inherited from his father and likely made worse by, all that studying.
So he studies at Bonn, then follows Ritschl to Leipzig. Ditches theology for philology.
Yep, became an ardent philologist. Forta had given him such excellent training, a real foundation, and a taste for ancient history.
And Leipzig sounds like it was a real intellectual melting pot for him.
Absolutely. The source calls it a torrent of influences. Hellenism, obviously, but also Schopenhauer and Wagner. He dove right in, but wasn't passive about it. He tested things, critiqued them.
He worked incredibly hard during this time.
Almost unbelievably hard. Packed years of work into just a couple. Had the constitution of a bear as the source puts it. Philology wasn't just an end in itself for him. It was a way to get at this bigger picture, this wider view of Hellenism he was developing.
And all this leads to him becoming a university professor at just 24.
Astonishingly young, yeah. One of Ritschl's best pupils, Jacob Burckhardt, famously called him as much an artist as a scholar. Ritschl himself said he could make scientific talks as exciting as a French novel.
High praise. Which brings us finally to his first major work at 28, The Birth of Tragedy. Our source calls it the first mature fruit, and it comes from his unique, what was the term, polyphonic nature.
That's the one. It's a crucial idea. He wasn't just a philologist or just a philosopher or just an artist. He had these multiple, sometimes conflicting talents, philosophy, art, science, all somehow pushing towards a single goal.
So the book itself reflects that.
Exactly. It's this centaur creation, as the notes call it, something that maybe only someone with that kind of multifaceted inner life could produce. It's fundamental to understanding him, really.
Okay, so that sets the scene. The man, the context. Now, let's get into the big idea. The absolute core of the birth of tragedy seems to revolve around these two fundamental artistic forces he identifies.
That's right. He argues that the entire history, the development of Greek art, is tied to this duality, what he calls the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Apollonian and Dionysian.
Yeah, he sees them almost like sexes, locked in this perpetual conflict, but also needing each other to create anything, and they periodically reconcile. He borrows the names, obviously, from the Greek art deities Apollo and Dionysus.
Okay, let's break that down. Start with the Apollonian. What does that represent for him?
Think of the Apollonian as the principle of, well, form, order, beauty, and importantly, individual identity. It's linked to the plastic arts like sculpture and very much to the world of dreams.
Dreams. Why dreams?
Because dreams, he argues, present reality with this perfect form, clear figures, nothing messy or superfluous. They give us these beautiful appearances.
So dreams are like artistic inspiration.
Yes, but maybe more fundamentally, they give us this intuition that our everyday reality might itself be a kind of appearance, a beautiful illusion covering something else. He even links this to Schopenhauer. Seeing the world as appearance is a sign of philosophical depth.
And Apollo, the god, demands measured limitation.
Exactly. Apollo is the god of boundaries, of order, self-knowledge, know thyself, nothing in excess. Anything that transgresses limits the titanic, the barbaric that's outside the Apollonian sphere. Mythical figures like Prometheus or Oedipus, they overstep and they meet destruction. That's the Apollonian view.
Okay, so Apollonian, form, order, clarity, individual boundaries, dreams, appearance. Got it. What about the Dionysian?
The Dionysian is basically the opposite force. It's about breaking boundaries, the dissolution of the individual. It's associated primarily with the non-plastic art of music.
Music. And the experience is?
He describes it as this overwhelming mix of awe and terror at the collapse of what he calls the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, the sense of being a separate self. And this is combined with a kind of ecstatic bliss.
The collapse of individuation. What does that feel like? How does he describe it?
Well, the main analogy he uses is drunkenness. It's that state where your subjective self just kind of vanishes. Barriers between people dissolve. You feel this intense unity, reconciliation, almost blending with others. He says it's like the veil of Maya. The illusion of separateness is torn away.
He points to things like medieval dancers, the St. Vitus dancers, examples.
Yes, he sees them as echoes of ancient Bacchic choruses, these hints of deep ecstatic origins that more cadaverous, supposedly healthy cultures tend to scorn. In the Dionysian state, man isn't just an artist looking at forms. He becomes a work of art himself, animated by the raw, primal power of nature.
He mentions that cry from the Eleusinian mysteries. You prostrate yourselves, millions. Do you sense the creator world?
Yes. It captures that sense of the individual dissolving into something larger, overwhelming, unifying. The Greek Dionysian festivals, he argues, weren't just wild parties. They were festivals of world redemption, transfiguration, an artistic jubilee where nature's power really broke through.
But it's not all bliss. There's pain, too.
There can be, yes. Pain and joy can coexist in this state. Jubilation might bring forth cries of horror or wails over loss. Nature itself seems to sigh over being torn apart into individuals, but fundamentally he sees it as an artistic phenomenon.
Okay, so they seem like polar opposites. Order versus chaos, individual versus oneness. How do they actually interact?
And this is absolutely key. The Apollonian Greek, the lover of form and measure, certainly saw the Dionysian as threatening, titanic, barbaric, yet they couldn't deny its power or their own inner connection to it. He argues that the entire beautiful, moderate Apollonian world of the Greeks actually rested on this hidden foundation of suffering and knowledge that only the Dionysian could reveal.
Wow, so Apollo couldn't exist without Dionysus.
That's exactly his point. The titanic and barbaric forces were just as necessary as the Apollonian drive for form. There was this fundamental tension. You see it in Doric art, maybe trying to reject the Dionysian, but the impulses were just too strong. In the Hellenic nature, it led to this powerful need for reconciliation.
And that reconciliation, that's where tragedy comes in.
Yes, that's the punchline, in a way. Greek tragedy is the ultimate metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will. It's the pairing, the fusion, the reconciliation of these two antagonistic forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. He argues this was fully achieved in Attic tragedy and maybe the dramatic dithyramb.
Okay, but what about lyric poetry? The poet who always says, I. How does that fit? It seems very individual, very Apollonian maybe.
But he tackles this head on. He actually challenges the whole idea of the subjective artist, at least in the simple sense. The desiring individual, the empirical I, isn't the true artist, he claims.
So what is the lyric poet doing then?
The lyrist, as a Dionysian artist, first merges with what he calls the primordial unity, experiences its pain, its contradictions, and from that state produces music which he sees as a direct copy, an expression of that primordial unity.
Okay, so where does the poem, the words come from?
That's the second step. Under Apollonian dream inspiration, this primal music becomes visible, takes form as a symbolic dream picture, the poem. The formless pain expressed in the music generates a concrete symbol. The artist has already surrendered their empirical subjectivity in that first Dionysian stage. The I that speaks in the poem. It sounds from the abyss of being, not just from the person Archilochus, for example.
He uses Archilochus specifically.
Yes, arguing that Archilochus's powerful poems of love and contempt weren't just personal outpourings. They grew out of this Dionysian state, this musical state, and were then given form by Apollonian vision, like the drunken poet touched by Apollo's laurel wreath while he sleeps. The lyric poem is like a picture spark, thrown off by the Dionysian music, made visible through Apollonian means.
So it's poetry interpreting music, not the other way around.
Precisely. The lyric genius creates a world of pictures and symbols out of that musical, mystical state. Music is the primary reality here. The image, the poem, is its manifestation, its interpretation.
Okay, that's a radical way of looking at it. And this leads him to say the tragic chorus is absolutely central.
Absolutely central. He calls it the real protodrama, the origin. He pushes back hard against interpretations that see the chorus as just, ideal spectators or some kind of moral compass representing the people.
Because historically, tragedy started as just the chorus.
Right. Tradition says tragedy was originally just the chorus. And as he asks, how can you be an ideal spectator if there's no play to spectate? It's absurd.
He likes Schiller's view better.
He does. Schiller saw the chorus as a kind of living wall against naturalism, a deliberate artistic choice not to just show mundane reality. The author totally agrees with this, contrasting it with what he sees as a shallow, modern worship of the natural and the real.
And the satyr chorus is important here, too. What does that represent?
The satyr chorus embodies this deep longing for the primitive, the natural, but it's an idealized, artistic version. It's seeking an unvarnished truth, a contrast to the perceived falsehood of culture. He actually calls the satyr chorus a saving deed of Greek art.
Saving? How so?
Because it allows the audience or the participant to confront the terrifying insights of the Dionysian state, that underlying chaos and suffering, without being completely overwhelmed or destroyed by it. It provides an artistic buffer, an image.
So the chorus members themselves are transformed in this process.
Yes, he sees them as a community of unconscious actors, mutually transformed by the experience. This enchantment is a prerequisite for all dramatic art, he thinks. The Dionysian reveler literally sees himself as a satyr. And then, as a satyr, he beholds the god Dionysus. That beholding, that vision, that's the Apollonian consummation.
So tragedy is born from that interaction.
Exactly. Greek tragedy is the Dionysian chorus disburdening itself, expressing itself within an Apollonian world of pictures. The choric parts are the mother womb, he says, from which the dialogue, the plot, the whole stage world emerges.
And Dionysus himself wasn't initially even on stage.
Not physically present, no. He was imagined, felt, present in the music and the ecstatic state of the chorus. It was only later, when attempts were made to actually show the god or the tragic hero as this visionary figure, that drama in the narrower sense began.
So the chorus prepares the audience.
It excites the frenzy, the Dionysian state, so the audience sees the hero not just as some actor in a mask, but as this visionary figure emerging from the music. The Apollonian elements, the mask, the plot, the images are absolutely necessary productions. They make the terrible Dionysian truth bearable, like shining spots, he says, to heal an eye seared by looking into the darkness.
And this explains Greek cheerfulness.
Yeah.
Not simple happiness,
But a triumph over profound suffering and insight. It's not the cheerfulness of unendangered comfort, it's the cheerfulness born from having stared into the abyss and survived through art.
wow. Okay, so how does he apply this to the specific tragic heroes? What about Oedipus?
In Sophocles' Oedipus, he sees the noble man destined for error and misery despite his wisdom, not because of some simple flaw. The suffering isn't just punishment, it's woven into his being, his striving. And this extraordinary suffering has a kind of magical, wholesome influence. It forces the noble man and us to sound the depths of things. He doesn't sin in the ordinary sense. The moral world might crumble through his actions, but a higher sphere of understanding opens up.
And Prometheus, in Aeschylus. He's different.
Very different energy. Prometheus is the glory of activity, of striving. Man elevating himself to the rank of Titan, acquiring culture through his own efforts, forcing the gods to ally with him. It's a hymn of impiety in a way, but born from this deep yearning for justice. It embodies the suffering of the single-handed, striving individual, and also this divine need for reconciliation. He sees Moira, eternal justice, as this ultimate force, even above the gods.
And he contrasts this kind of crime with the Semitic idea of sin.
Yes, quite explicitly. He draws a distinction between Aryan and Semitic myth. The Prometheus story is about a crime committed by a man, a titanically striving individual who suffers precisely because of his individuation for trespassing bounds set by Apollo. The fall of man, in contrast, is a sin attributed to woman, rooted in curiosity, feminine passions, seduction.
So Aeschylus' Prometheus shows both sides.
He sees Prometheus as embodying this double being, both Dionysian striving and Apollonian suffering for boundary crossing. It reflects this complex truth that whatever exists is alike just and unjust, and equally justified in both.
This intense focus on suffering and transgression leads him to what he calls the mystery doctrine of tragedy.
Right, and this doctrine stems from a fundamentally, well, pessimistic view of existence, at least on the surface level of individuation. He draws on Platonic ideas. Tragic figures aren't just copies of real people, they're images of an idea, an eternal contradiction.
And the central image is Dionysus himself.
Yes, the suffering Dionysus, Zagreus, who is dismembered by the Titans. This dismemberment for him is the ultimate symbol of individuation, the breaking apart of the primordial unity into separate beings. And that individuation is the primal cause of all suffering. It's inherently objectionable from this deep mystical perspective.
So being an individual is the root problem.
In this view, yes, it's the source of suffering. From Dionysus' smile came the gods, from his tears came man, showing that dual nature, cruel demon and mild ruler.
But there's hope in this. It sounds quite bleak.
There is hope, but it comes through art. The mystery doctrine offers the hope for a new birth of Dionysus. This signifies the end of individuation, a reunification, a return to that primal oneness. Tragedy gives us this fundamental knowledge, the oneness of all things. Individuation as evil, but through the artistic experience, it offers a glimpse, an augury, that the spell of individuation can be broken, that oneness can be restored.
So tragedy was this incredible fusion, this miracle holding these forces together, but he argues it died, and not peacefully.
No, a violent death, he says. Unlike older art forms that just faded away, Greek tragedy's death left this huge void. And it happened relatively quickly.
And the culprit, in his view, is mainly Euripides.
He identifies Euripides as the one fighting this death struggle, the one whose work embodies the decline. The art that came after, like New Attic comedy, he sees as just a degenerate form, a monument to tragedy's painful end. He notes how attached those later comedy writers were to Euripides.
Okay, so what did Euripides do that was so destructive, according to this view?
Well, fundamentally, Euripides dragged the commonplace individual, the everyday person from the audience, onto the stage. He started mirroring nature with painful exactness, focusing on mundane traits, psychological realism in a way we'd recognize.
Instead of the grand mythical figures.
Right. The noble hero, like Odysseus, becomes, in Euripides, more like the Grecculus, the cunning domestic slave type. Euripides thought he was freeing tragedy from pompousness, making it more relatable. But the author argues the spectator now just saw and heard his double on stage, rejoiced that they could talk so well, and basically learned how to speak, how to argue from Euripides.
So the audience and their everyday concerns became the focus, not the deeper mysteries.
Exactly. And with this shift, he argues, the Greeks started to lose their belief in an ideal past or future, even in immortality. Aged Hellenism became, in his word, frivolous, capricious, focused only on the passing moment, on wit, on levity. Even Greek cheerfulness changes, meaning it's no longer that hard-won triumph over suffering, but just the levity of decline. He even says the fifth class, the slaves, gains power and sentiment.
And he connects Euripides directly to a specific kind of spectator, or rather, a thinker, who represents that spectator, Socrates.
This is absolutely central to his argument. He claims Euripides, maybe not fully understanding the deeper Dionysian roots of Aeschylus and Sophocles, instinctively sought out the spectator who also didn't comprehend it, and that spectator was Socrates.
Euripides becomes the poet of aesthetic Socratism. Is that the term?
That's the phrase, yeah. Euripides operates from this conscious intellectual principle. To be beautiful, everything must be known. He sees this as a direct parallel to Socrates' ethical principle. To be good, everything must be known.
Knowledge above all else.
Right. Euripides thought the older poets wrought unconsciously, which the author thinks is wrong. Euripides believed he was bringing conscious understanding, reason, to art, like Anaxagoras bringing order to the primal chaos.
And Socrates himself is seen as the ultimate demoniac power who destroyed tragedy. That's strong language.
Incredibly strong. Socrates is portrayed as this force of unchecked logical rationalism, an instinct against instinct that shattered the beautiful, complex world of Greek tragedy and the Greek character itself.
How did Socrates view tragedy?
Socrates' eye, which the author says fine frenzy never glowed in, saw tragedy as fundamentally irrational, absurd, full of random causes and effects, motley, repugnant to a truly thoughtful mind, and maybe even dangerous to sensitive souls. Tragedy, for Socrates, was art for those with little wit, not for philosophers. Seductive, representing the agreeable rather than the useful, he required his followers to abstain from it.
But Plato, Socrates' student, was still an artist in his own way.
He was, and that's a paradox the author explores. Even though Plato condemned tragedy in certain arts, he was compelled by his own artistic necessity to create a new form, the dialogue.
And the dialogue's like,
The author sees it almost like a lifeboat. Ancient poetry and its children saved themselves by climbing into Plato's boat, with Socrates as the steersman. The Platonic dialogue becomes the prototype of the novel, where poetry is reduced to being the ancilla, the handmaid, of dialectic philosophy.
So rational thought, philosophical argument completely overshadows artistic intuition.
That's the claim. Philosophic thought overgrows art, forces it to cling to dialectics. The Apollonian impulse gets reduced to logical schematism, and the Dionysian, especially music, becomes mere imitation of phenomena, trying to represent things rather than being a primal force itself.
And this affects the structure of plays, too.
Yes. Things like the transcendental justice you find in Aeschylus get degraded into simple poetic justice. You need the deus ex machina, the god from the machine, to come in and artificially resolve plots, because the internal logic, the deeper mythic necessity, is gone, and the chorus becomes just an accidental, dispensable remnant. You can't understand its original power from this later perspective.
But was Socrates himself entirely certain? You mentioned a dream.
It's a fascinating point raised in the source, this recurring dream apparition telling him, Socrates, practice music. While he generally saw philosophizing as the highest music, the highest art, in prison he did apparently practice common music, composing a poem on Apollo, versifying some fables. Prompted maybe by his daemonian voice and Apollonian insight perhaps, he even wondered, apparently, perhaps what is not intelligible to me is not therefore unreasonable. A flicker of doubt.
A flicker, maybe. But his overall legacy in this view remains this theoretical optimism.
Yes, he's the archetype of the theoretical optimist, the belief that nature is completely fathomable, that knowledge is the universal medicine, that error is the only real evil, the core belief that thought can not only perceive being, but can actually correct it.
Which the author calls a sublime metaphysical illusion.
Right. This idea that science, if pushed far enough, eventually reaches its limits and has to turn back into art, that's the illusion. Socrates is seen as the first who could not only live but also die by science, by this belief in reason. And the whole arc of the Hellenic character, from Homer to Socrates, becomes this standard, this peak, against which later ages measure themselves, often feeling inferior, sometimes lashing out and calling the Greeks barbaric for anything not like themselves.
This critique of Socratism then leads him directly to diagnose his own time, which he labels an Alexandrine age.
Exactly. He sees his contemporary culture as defined by the same theoretical optimism inherited from Socrates via Alexandria. The typical Alexandrine man believes the world can be understood and amended purely through knowledge. Science is the universal medicine.
And this spirit actively combats the Dionysian.
Yes, it combats Dionysian art and wisdom. It dissolves myth, replacing deep metaphysical comforts with promises of earthly consonance, earthly happiness, maybe aided by a rational machine god. Crucially, this kind of culture, or person, cannot really feel or acknowledge the original wound of existence. It's deluded itself into forgetting fundamental displeasure, fundamental suffering.
And he warns this optimism has really dangerous consequences down the line.
He does. The source is quite stark here. It warns that the fruits of this optimism eventually ripen into wanton agitations, restless desires, and ultimately threatening demands for universal earthly happiness. He argues that Alexandrine culture requires a slave class to function, maybe interpreted broadly as requiring some foundation of unacknowledged labor or suffering. But its optimistic ideology denies the necessity of this foundation.
So what happens when that's challenged?
When talk of the dignity of man or dignity of labor seduces this barbaric slave class, as he puts it, they learn to see their own existence as an injustice, and they seek vengeance for it. This, he warns, leads towards a dreadful destination. Meanwhile, existing religions seem pale and exhausted, scholastic, myth is paralyzed, the optimistic spirit has taken over.
So he sees his contemporary theoretical culture as being in a state of crisis.
Deep crisis. He feels modern man is becoming disquieted by the evil slumbering within this culture. Socratic culture is shaken, becoming afraid of its own logical conclusions, starting to doubt its own foundations. There's a sense of fragmentation, a breach. Theoretical man avoids confronting the terrible ice stream of existence, spoiled by easy optimism. A culture built solely on science, he believes, must perish when it becomes illogical, when it refuses to face the deeper, non-rational realities.
And art reflects this crisis. It becomes a symptom.
Very much so. Art in this age, he argues, vainly imitates all past styles. It accumulates knowledge, creates world literature, labels everything, but it remains a hungerer, a critic, an Alexandrine man at heart. It can't generate real life from itself. It consumes nourishment and turns it into history and criticism.
He singles out opera as a prime example of this Alexandrine art.
Yes, he gives opera a pretty harsh critique. He sees it as driven by fundamentally unaesthetic, extra-artistic tendencies, like a sentimental yearning for an idol, a naive belief in some prehistoric, naturally artistic good man.
The recite of the singing speech is part of that.
He sees it as an attempt to artificially recover the language of this imaginary primitive man. Opera becomes this fantasy land of the good creature who just naturally sings. It's based on what he considers a false belief, that every sentient person is inherently an artist. It's an expression of the laity's taste, dictating artistic laws with cheerful, uncritical optimism.
And its influence on music itself has been negative.
Fatal is the word used, because it prioritizes the words, the text, demanding it must be understood. Text becomes lord over counterpoint. Music is reduced to imitating phenomena, or just aiming for pleasing forms and proportions. It's completely alienated music from its true Dionysian role as a primary expression of the world will. It makes the phenomenon poor. It's all part of this universal slide towards the Alexandrine.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty bleak diagnosis. But after all that critique, he does find some hope, particularly in the German spirit.
Yes, surprisingly perhaps, he does find hope there. He believes the German spirit deep down remains somehow undestroyed, resting in some inaccessible abyss, dreaming. He sees it stirring at intervals. He points to the Reformation, the power of the Lutheran chorale hymn.
And German music more recently.
Absolutely. German music, the lineage from Bach through Beethoven to implicitly Wagner, is seen as this immense power arising directly from that Dionysian root, a force that is terribly inexplicable, even hostile to the dominant Socratic culture.
And German philosophy plays a role too, Kant and Schopenhauer.
Yes. He credits Kant and Schopenhauer with making it possible to finally annihilate the self-satisfied delight of scientific Socratism. By showing the boundaries of reason, the limits of knowledge, they open the way for a much more profound, more serious engagement with the problem of existence itself.
So he sees a potential for Germany to reverse the Greek trajectory.
It's a fascinating idea he floats. Where the Greeks moved from the tragic age to the Alexandrine, he suggests the German genius might be moving in reverse, from a kind of Alexandrine phase back towards a potential tragic age. The birth of tragedy for the German spirit would be a return to itself, a blessed self-rediscovering after being dominated by external rationalistic influences.
And learning from the Greeks is key here.
Vital. But learning implicitly, guiding themselves by that Greek example now, especially as they face this potential rebirth, without fully knowing where it's leading. It's a perilous time.
But he's also critical of how German culture has been engaging with the Greeks.
Oh, yes. He feels that the efforts since figures like Goethe, Schiller, Winckelmann, while important, have weakened. Perhaps the champions couldn't penetrate to the real core of the Hellenic spirit. Opinions on Greek value have degenerated, he thinks, into either compassionate superiority or just ineffective superficial talk about Greek harmony, Greek beauty, Greek cheerfulness.
So the connection has become shallow.
Yes, teachers compromise, they abandon the true Hellenic ideal, culture and genuine art have become estranged, and this feeble culture is actually afraid of true, powerful art.
But despite these criticisms, he holds on to this faith in an impending rebirth of tragedy.
He expresses a strong, almost prophetic faith in it. The time of the Socratic man, the purely theoretical man, is past, he declares. He issues a call to become tragic men, to trust in Dionysian life and its promise of rebirth. The divine strength of Heracles, he says, cannot languish forever. The Dionysian spirit is awakening in the modern world.
And understanding the original Greek experience of tragedy's birth is vital for navigating this.
Absolutely crucial. He argues we need to learn from the Greeks what this kind of awakening signifies for the very basis of a people's life. He reminds us that the people of the tragic mysteries were the ones who fought off the Persians. They required tragedy as a kind of necessary healing potion.
He sees a really tight connection between art, myth, state, custom in ancient Greece. They were all interwoven.
Intrinsically linked, yes.
That's true.
Necessarily coalesced. The ruin of tragedy was also the ruin of myth. The Greeks didn't just live their lives, they involuntarily associated their experiences with their myths, comprehending reality through myth. The present appeared sub specie eterni under the aspect of eternity, timeless.
So myth gave life meaning.
It gave it metaphysical significance. The state and art both drew strength from this timeless realm, offering repose from the chaotic present. A people's real worth, he argues, lies in this ability to impress the stamp of eternity on its experiences, to desecularize life. The opposite happens when a people just historicizes itself, becoming purely temporal, which is the hallmark of Alexandrian culture.
And this Alexandrine tendency has broader consequences than just art.
Definitely. In its weakened form, it manifests as the optimism of science. But on a lower level, it can lead to this feverish searching, a pandemonium of disconnected myths and superstitions cobbled together. The Hellene in decline sat with a yearning heart, masking the fever with either forced cheerfulness and levity, or narcotizing himself with superstition.
So the path forward for the Germans involves reconnecting with their own mythical roots.
That's his passionate call. They must fight their own battles, rediscover their own household gods, their mythical home, restore uniquely German things. If they seek a guide in this, he says, listen to the delightfully luring call of the Dionysian bird. It will point the way.
He circles back near the end to the actual aesthetic pleasure we get from tragedy. It's not just about pity or fear.
No, he rejects those purely moral explanations. Art demands purity, he insists. The pleasure comes from something deeper. It's the Apollonian illusion within the tragedy that saves us from being completely overwhelmed by the raw Dionysian music. The musical excitement discharges itself onto the Apollonian domain. The drama, the images, the plot. We can perceive the drama, make it intelligible from within that musical state.
And the artist's role.
The tragic artist shares in the Apollonian delight in appearance, in the beautiful image, but simultaneously denies it, finds a higher satisfaction in its ultimate annihilation, its destruction within the tragic plot.
And to understand why ugliness and dissonance in art can bring pleasure, he says we need a metaphysics of art.
Yes. This is maybe his most audacious claim. Existence and the world are eternally justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon.
Only as an aesthetic phenomenon.
Oh, Right.
The function of tragic myth, then, is to convince us that even the ugly and discordant are part of an artistic game that the primordial will plays with itself, eternally creating and destroying the world of appearance. The pleasure we feel is the echo of this primordial joy in this cosmic artistic game.
So in tragedy, these two fundamental forces, Apollonian and Dionysian, finally reconcile aesthetically.
That's the culmination. The Apollonian illusion gives us delight in appearance, allows us to contemplate, justifies our individual existence. But the Dionysian insight, revealed through music and the myth's destruction, shows us the eternal joy behind phenomena, the indestructible will to existence that delights even in the annihilation of individuals. Tragedy holds both these truths in tension, reconciling them.
And the tragic spectator experiences this.
Yes, the ideal tragic spectator is exalted. They see the hero with epic clarity and beauty, Apollonian, but also delight in their annihilation, Dionysian. They comprehend the surface events but reach beyond them to anticipate this higher, primal artistic joy rooted in the primordial unity. He contrasts this deep mythic grounding with modern disintegration.
He does. He feels many modern people are disintegrated by the critico-historical spirit. We can only understand myth learnedly, academically. But myth, he insists, should be the unwritten law connecting a people to religion, to their deepest ideas, without that sacred, primitive foundation.
Culture becomes abstract.
Abstract man, abstract education, usage, rights, state, all independent of myth. Artistic imagination runs wild, unbridled by any native myth. It's a culture without roots, without a sacred home. This feverish stirring and searching is just hunger, tuning all nourishment into more history and criticism. He expresses real despair for the German character if it hasn't striven or doesn't strive for this reconnection to a mythic home.
But the hope still persists right to the end.
Yes, the hope persists. Beneath the surface of restless, civilized life, he believes a healthy, primeval power stirs, dreams of awakening. From this abyss came the Reformation, the chorale melody, and the Dionysian luring call, he believes, is now being answered by modern Dionysian revelers through German music, signaling the rebirth of German myth.
And music and myth remain inseparable for him.
Absolutely inseparable. Both are expressions of this fundamental Dionysian capacity of a people. They originate beyond the purely Apollonian sphere. They transfigure the world. They make dissonance and terrible images meaningful, bearable, even joyful. They play with the sting of displeasure. They justify even the worst world by revealing it as part of this aesthetic game.
So the Dionysian is the eternal force.
The eternal, original artistic force constantly creating the world of phenomena. The Apollonian is the necessary, ever-new, transfiguring appearance needed to keep the world of individuation alive and beautiful. These forces develop in mutual proportion.
And the rise of Dionysian power now implies.
It implies that a new Apollonian influence must also be descending. When Dionysian powers rise, as they seem to be doing then, and he points to Wagner, Apollo has already, in secret as it were, descended. The glorious effects of that Apollonian influence, the new forms, the new beauty, will be beheld by a coming generation.
He ends with that image of the Greeks.
Right. Walking under Ionic colonnades, the clear sky, the serious faces, leading to the question, what profound suffering must this people have undergone to become so beautiful? And the answer is, go to a tragic play. Sacrifice in the temples of both deities, Apollo and Dionysus. You need both.
What a journey indeed. We followed this thinker from his polyphonic origins through this revolutionary concept of the Apollonian and Dionysian.
Yeah, seeing how we argued they birthed Greek tragedy, were reconciled in it.
Then witnessed tragedy's death, in his view, at the hands of Socratism and that theoretical optimism.
Diagnosed the ills of the subsequent Alexandrine age.
And finally, found this, maybe surprising, hope for a rebirth, rooted in modern music and a return to myth.
It's just such a radical way of linking art, culture, and the deep structures of existence. These forces constantly at play.
And here's where it really leaves you thinking, I think. He argues pretty forcefully that cultures built purely on theoretical optimism, cultures that try to deny the necessity of a slave class, maybe read that broadly as denying any fundamental suffering, limitation, or inherent difficulty in existence, that these cultures were ultimately headed towards a dreadful destination when reality bites back.
Right. Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty powerful question, doesn't it? Can any society, any culture, truly flourish long-term if it systematically tries to avoid or deny these profound truths about suffering, about limitation, about the messy, irrational depths of human experience?
Or does it eventually, inevitably, have to confront the very things it tried so hard to push away?
Something to wrestle with, for sure.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Always fascinating to explore these foundational, challenging ideas.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into something unexpected.